Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have briefly stepped out of the cottage where I sometimes reside around the time of Easter, which you can see here. Now I should like to relate to you a story about little Arthur Schopenhauer and Georg Hegel. Little Arthur despised Georg Hegel. The reason for this is that, well, Hegel apparently was on his Viva committee of his PhD and did not quite understand Schopenhauer's remarks on the fourfold cause. And ever since that time, little Arthur held a grudge against the Grand Master of Spirit, Hegel himself. And during this time, when Hegel became famous, a superstar in philosophy, which would have been around 1815 or 16 or so in Berlin, Hegel taught to hundreds of students. The lecture halls were filled with people. And Arthur Schopenhauer was a Privatdozent at the time, so he was a private lecturer and held his lectures purposely at the same time as Hegel. And Arthur's lectures weren't quite as well visited, shall we say, as Hegel's, but he didn't mind. And as you know, Schopenhauer believed that the world to be at its core, in its essence, nothing but an insatiable blind will that wills itself, and as it wills itself, or it instantiates entities like the human being and plants and animals, and all of life is really suffering, blind, irrational, meaningless, pointless suffering to no end. As he says at some point in the second volume of his World as Will and Representation, it would be better for all existence not to be looking back over the millennia, the wars, the destruction, and the genocide, and the killing, the pointless killing. This is rather different from Hegel's point of view, I should like to add. And Hegel believed, of course, not that the world is inherently rational, but that history, as it plays out its principle of freedom, will be showing itself as ever more free. But Hegel, to his credit, does say that history is a slaughter bench. And by the way, just to mention this, Schopenhauer, because this question is sometimes raised, Schopenhauer is not a German idealist. He is an idealist, but he's a dogmatic idealist. He believes that the world is nothing but representation. But this is not the idealism of Schelling or even of Hegel, of course. And as a matter of fact, Schopenhauer moves back behind Kant. So Schopenhauer, even though he believes that he bases his philosophy on Kant, completely butchers Kant and believes that the thing in itself is a concrete substance, an actual thing from which all other beings emanate. And this is dogmatic, crude kindergarten metaphysics, isn't it? So, Schopenhauer did not quite grasp his Grandmaster Kant, which is unfortunate for him, perhaps, but he did understand something else, funnily enough. When the cholera broke out in 1830 or so in Berlin, Schopenhauer immediately escaped and he ran off to Frankfurt, where he was safe from the cholera, from the pandemic at the time. Hegel, of course, remained, perhaps believing that the world is, in fact, becoming ever more free and more enlightened, perhaps, more rational, and that presumably the prophet of spirit will be spared from the cholera. These are just baseless speculations on my part, of course, but Well, Hegel died of the cholera. And when Schopenhauer heard the news, the unfortunate news of course, he apparently threw a party in honor of Hegel's death. So with this wonderful little story of the intellectual climate at the time, I shall now retire back into my little cottage and hope to see you very soon indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.